In this video, we will cover markers and inputs in transformation steps. So let's look at the transformation spec here in this particular example. So we have some business list. We do a select on some columns, enrich. Here we have a lit agree. We put a source system and some UID and so on, global UID, and then we enrich the data frame. We deduplicate and write it to a output entity called business. Now, one thing if you have noticed in most of the transformation pipelines, the steps are normally kind of linear. You go from step one, then there is some data alive here. That data goes in, then there's some data coming out here, and then data goes into the enrich and comes out, right? And something happens, and there's new data set here, and so on, and finally return to business. So it's into progress on a step-by-step basis without any branching. Sometimes you may want to branch from here. Let's say at the enrich step, let's say assume that you want to write the enriched data but without deduplicating, and also want to do this simultaneously. You want to write the duplicated data. Now, how do we kind of remember what came out of the enriched data? If we have noticed so far in most of the transformation steps, there are two things called marker and inputs. I'll get to input later. Let's work with marker. Let's say that I want to use the output of this particular intermediary step in a later transformation. I would go and mark this. In this particular case, I'm going to mark it as pre-dedup marker, right? And then I said apply. Once you apply, save it, because then the marker will be available. Now that I have marked this here, I can write this data out without deduplicating it. Now this step goes to the deduplicate data, and then I want one without the deduplication happening. So I create another derived entity. I open it and then I say this is business node. This is business data, does not duplicate it. Sinks, of course, is a consumption sink. That's the only sink associated with this particular pipeline. Now I go here to input and say, hey, my input comes from, right? We'll get back to these 4 steps later. These are default that comes with the pipeline. I'm going to say, I want the data from the step that is marked with this particular marker. Now and then I go select my columns and say, I want all the columns. Add, I apply. And now the output of this is going to come from this, but there's an issue because this is basically, it doesn't have any connectors. So we normally connect it to the last step in the transformation before we write. So even though this particular business node DW is connected to deduplicate, but the data is actually coming from the output of this particular enrich step before the deduplicate happens. So you have two outputs, one with the deduplicate data which goes here, and then the one with the marker picks up the data that is coming out of this enrich. That is one. I'll also show you another case where we can use marker. Let's say that you have enriched this data. Now we have written two outputs here. You want a third output in which you want to filter something out of this data. So let's say I'll get a filter operator. I put it over here and then I open this. I'm just going to say 1 is equal to 1. You can put any operator you want based on any column or any other thing. But for this particular demo, I'm going to say filter everything. And I'm going to say the input. Here I'm not specifying a marker. I'm saying the input to this filter is going to come from this. And then I say apply. Then I write some data out to this. So I create another entity, derived entity, and then I put it here. And then I connect this to that. And then I give it a name, business filter, right? There's no input here because this is directly coming from filter. So you don't have to specify the filter here. Select the sink consumption sink, and then same thing, going to select all the columns, then apply, save. Now I'll do my auto layout here. So this looks a little better. And then probably want to move this here, filter, move it here. There are two things we have done with the marker. We marked this particular data that's coming out of this enrich, and then that's the input to the filter, and then there's an output written. The same marker goes into this one, right? The data coming out of this goes to this step and we write it out. So that's a power of marker and input. And this might be deprecated in a future version, but it will be supported. We may have some other better way to do this. Okay. All right. Thanks.